With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Mem Ches. We're going to start with the Mishnah, 4 lines from the top of the Amid. What we will actually have is a clarification, and we're going to go into details for all of the various dinim that we began on Daf Mem Beis, Amid Beis in the Mishnah. Right, so we began learning that Hallel, which means the mitzvah to recite the full Hallel, and Vahasimcha, the mitzvah to rejoice over Yantiv, is Shmoina. So that's going to be clarified in the Mishnah. We're going to be speaking about what one needs to do to take the Sukah down in a way that since there is a prohibition of adding to the mitzvahs of Baal Toisev, Sukkah ends at the end of the 7th day. Let's go to Eretz Yisrael. You can't even give off the appearance that you're adding to the mitzvah. So we will see there's something that ideally should be done for it to be clear that even if someone is going to be eating the 8th day in the Sukkah in Eretz Yisrael, it should be clear that they're not doing so because they are trying to fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah or the adding to the mitzvah of the Sukkah. They have no better place where to sit and to eat. And many details about the concept of Maras Ayin concerning Baal Toisef. Then we're going to go into the next Mishnah. That's going to focus on the next detail we had in the Mishnah on Daf Mem Beis Amid Beis, and that is concerning the Nisuch Hamayim ceremony, the pouring of the water ceremony. We're going to learn about the 2 bowls that were on the top of the southern western corner of the altar. We're going to have on Daf Mem Ches Amid Beis a very interesting conversation, an agadata between Sasoin and Simcha, as we will explain the meaning, or perhaps a suggested meaning of that conversation. We're going to learn that even though the rule was, especially in the temple, that Kol Pinoi Sha'ata Poine, that whenever a person is turning, they should turn towards right. Applying that to the altar, that means that when the kohen went up the ramp to the altar, he would turn right, and then he would normally circle around the altar if he needed to. There were 3 exceptions to that. There were 3 times that when he went up the altar, he turned a very sharp left. One of them was when he would pour the nesachim, as we will learn in our sugya. We're going to learn that there were, in the bowls that were on top of the altar, there were holes underneath them. And therefore, whatever was poured in the bowl ultimately made its way down into the shisin, which were 2 holes that went very deep inside the core of the earth. And we're going to learn a lot about the shisin tomorrow on Daf Mem Tes. We're going to learn about the one time, we know that it was Alexander Yanai, who instead of pouring the water in the bowl, being that he rejected the halacha l'Moshe Missinai, he poured the water of the water libation on his feet, and how people realized that he was doing, and how they pelted him with esrogim, and it got a little bit violent because some people decided to actually throw rocks, and how a rock invalidated the altar, and a lot more. So again, Daf Mem Ches Amid Aleph, towards the top of the Amid, beginning with the Mishnah. Now this Perek, Lula Va'arava, that's how the Mishnah began on Daf Mem Beis Amid Beis, went through the various mitzvahs that are connected to Sukkahs, and the Mishnah began to tell you how much time does each mitzvah have to be fulfilled for. So Lula Va'arava we learned 6 or 7. And now we are up to the Hallel and the Simcha. So when the Mishnah says that the mitzvah of Hallel, which means the rabbinic mitzvah of reciting full Hallel, the Hasimcha, the mitzvah to rejoice, and the primary way that one rejoices over the holiday of Yom Tov is by eating the meat of the Korban Shlamim. And both of these are Shmoina, are for the 7 days and the 8th day Shmini Atzeres. Ketzad, says the Mishnah Melamed, that the Mishnah is teaching us Shechayiv Adam B'Halel and B'Simcha U'B'Chavoid Yom Tov Achron Shel Chag, and in giving all other honors to the final day of the Yom Tov, which means Shmini Atzeres, just like Keshar Kol Yemai Chag, just like one is obligated to do so during the 7 days of Sukkot. And there is a big chiddush in that, and the chiddush is that if you open up the Psukim in the Torah, and yes, the Torah says V'samachta b'chagecha, but you will notice that the words of the mitzvah of rejoicing, and we're going to primarily celebrate rejoicing during the times of the temple by eating the meat of the Korban Shlamim. The Torah links V'samachta b'chagecha to 7 days of Sukkot. and there isn't a explicit rejoice v'samachta b'chagecha connected to Shmini Atzeres. So asks the Gemara, indeed, how do we know that the mitzvah of Simcha is also for Shmini Atzeres? So the Tanach Rabbanan, we learned in a Braisa that when it says in Parshas Re'eh, and there also the pasuk is focusing on Sukkos. The pasuk says Shivas Yomim Tachoig, etc., etc. But at the end of that verse it says V'hoyisa ach sameach, and you shall be nothing but joyous. The entire phrase is superfluous because the Torah already began. 2 psukim ago it says this Shivas Yomim Tachoig. So this V'hoyisa ach sameach l'rabois, this comes to add. We are beginning with the night going into Shmini Atzeres. This is important. When we speak about adding the night going into Shmini Atzeres, first of all, if you have to have Simcha the night of, then Avada, then for sure you have to have Simcha the day of. The point of Braisa focusing on the night of Shmini Atzeres is very simple. And we mentioned this yesterday. A shlamim, once you slaughter the carbon, you may eat the meat for 2 days and 1 night. If there only would have been a mitzvah of having Simcha, B'zman HaBayis, by eating the meat of the shlamim for the 7 days, that would have obliged people to shech the shlamim even on the 6th day of Sukkahs. When you slaughter the animal on the 6th day, you can eat the meat on the 6th and on the 7th, and you're good. You would have simcha for all of the 7 days of Sukkahs. But exactly that, the meat of the shlamim can only be eaten for 2 days and 1 night, the night prior to the 2nd day. The night going into the 8th would have been beyond the expiration. If a person would have left over meat, it would have been, God forbid, noisar. By the fact that the Torah is adding this v'hoyisa ach sameach, by telling you have to have meat even in the night going into the 8th, that demands of us to shech, to slaughter another carbon shlamim on the 7th day of Sukkot, and now you will be allowed to eat the meat at night, and for sure there'll be the mitzvah of continuing that simcha, because the main celebration is on the day, also during the 8th day, as the Mishnah says, that simcha shmoina. Now the Braisa is saying, hold on, let's think about this. If the way we celebrated Simcha during the times of the temple is primarily by eating the meat of a carbon shlamim. Now I get it that in the morning of the first day, we would bring a carbon, and that would be the rejoicing of the first daytime of the day. But what about the night going into Yom Tov? What about the first night of Yom Tov? So actually, there was no obligation to eat meat then. The only way one would have had meat of a carbon can never be slaughtered that night, is if one would have been obligated to slaughter a carbon, a shlamim, erev Sukkos. There is no such obligation. Just a contrast, by Pesach, if you remember, not only is there a mitzvah to slaughter the carbon Pesach, erev Pesach, but there's the concept of the Shalmei Yudalid. There is no such a thing by Sukkos. So the Braisa is asking, Upa, v'hoyisa ach samech is coming to add. Who told you it's coming to add the night going into the 8th? Automatically, for sure, the 8th. Maybe this extra phrase is coming to tell you that there is a biblical obligation to slaughter a shlamim on the 14th day of Tishrei, on erev Sukkos. In order for there to be meat to be eaten the first night of Yom Tov, answers the Braisa, no. That since the Torah uses the words ach, but kishuoimer ach, the word ach qualifies, chilek, qualifies, meaning, listen, the entire phrase is inclusive. No, the whole thing is superfluous. V'hayisa ach sameach is adding, but the word ach is restrictive. So we are restricting, we are excluding the first night, we are including the last night. And the Braisa says, maybe punk fakert. Answers the Braisa. And that's a very important rule. Whenever there is something that has to be excluded and something has to be included, the onus of proof is to include something that is a greater novelty. It's easier to include something that is more obvious. And if you have a doubt, you only include that which is more obvious. That which is less obvious, that which is a greater chiddush, you have to prove that it's including that which is of the greater chiddush. Now, why is the night going into Shmini Atzeres, so to say, a easier night to include? Since sheyesh simcha lefanav, it's already preceded by days of rejoicing. When a person is in a simcha mode, adding to it is easier than initiating it. So since we don't know, logically include that which is of a of a lesser of a novelty and exclude that which would be a much greater chiddush, unless you can prove that it's including that which is of the greater chiddush. Okay, next Mishnah. Again, we are all referring back to the Mishnah on Daf Mem Beis, Amid Beis. The Mishnah there writes that in contrast with Hallel and Simcha, that is equal for all 8 days, 7 days of Sukkot and of Shmini Atzeres, the mitzvah of Sukah is only on the 7th day. Now, says the Mishnah, Sukah, Shiva, Ketzad, Gomar, Mila'echol, which means if you've ate your final meal on the 7th day, and a person might think, well, I'm done with the Sukkah. We don't sit Shmini Atzeres in the Sukkah, like I says, because if you do so, l'shei mitzvah, then you are violating, adding to the mitzvah. Even if you don't have the intent of fulfilling the mitzvah, it gives the appearance, and you have to deal with that you're adding to the mitzvah. So a person might decide, let me take my Sukkah apart. Now, Chavra, don't forget that in Eretz Yisrael, the 7th day, like over here, it's Chol HaMoed. In other words, we call it Toshana Rabbah. You can take the Sukkah apart. So there's no problem with building or dismantling, but you can't do that. Says the Mishnah, Lo yatir es sukkasoi. Don't disassemble your Sukkah. You know why you should not disassemble it? Because you have to dwell in the Sukkah for the entirety of the 7 days. So like Rashi says, if a person wants to chap a nap, and sleeping, like we mentioned, is even more strict than eating. Eating, at least arai, temporary, you can have out of the Sukkah. But to have a nap, you can't even nap outside the Sukkah. If you're going to decide to have another meal, you have to eat it all the way until the end of the 7th day in the Sukkah. So leave the Sukkah standing. But for one reason the Mishnah will mention, and another reason the Gemara will mention, the reason that the Mishnah is going to focus on is that it's important for a person to do something in preparation of the Yom Tov of the 8th day. It's like a balance. You want to start preparing for the 8th day. You want to give honor to the 8th day by starting to prepare for it already at the end of the 7th day. So what should you do? What prep should you do? That once you reach the time of Mincha, we are referring to Mincha Ketana. Mincha Ketana means 2.5 hours prior to Shkia. You should already take down. Remember, the Sukah is in the times of the Mishnah, and the Gemara were on the roof. Take down your utensils, furniture and utensils. They include, everything is included in the word kalim. Like this, Rashi says, you will show that you are giving honor to the last day. You are preparing for the 8th day. The 8th day you're not going to eat in the Sukkah. But at least you did something that shows that you're getting ready for the 8th day. Says the Gemara, and the Gemara's question is based on the premise that the reason why we should already take the furniture out of the Sukkah at the end of the 7th isn't only to show that we're preparing in honor of the 8th day, but also, like we mentioned, because eating properly in the Sukkah on the 8th day, if you're doing it for the mitzvah, then you're violating the biblical commandment of Baal Tosef. Even if you're not intending to do the mitzvah, it's maras ayin. It looks like you're adding. So, and therefore, if you would have dismantled the Sukkah, it would have been even better. To make it clear, you're not sitting in the Sukkah. There's no valid Sukkah. So, what happens if you don't have any furniture to take down? The Gemara right away challenges, what do you mean you don't have any kalim? What were you doing for the 7 days? Ella clarifies the Gemara. If a person practically doesn't have a place where to eat other than the Sukkah. And my friends, this is very common. It's especially common when you have, like by us in Chabad Sola, you have a large group, Baruch Hashem, hundreds of people eat together. The most convenient place where to eat, or I'll tell you more, the only place where you have where to eat is in where you ate in the Sukkah. So what should you do so it should be clear that you're not adding to the mitzvah? Rab Chia bar, either Rav or the Rosh has the Girsa. Rab Chia bar Ashi Omar, you actually invalidate the Sukkah. How do you invalidate the Sukkah? Poiches ba arba'a. You make a breach of 4 tfachim of open space. Upa, everyone jumps on this. Guys, you remember? We learned this in the beginning of the Masechta. If you have invalid schach invalidates the Sukkah if it's 4 tfachim or more. But if it's open space, even 3 tvachim invalidate the sukkah. Why is the Gemara speaking about making a breach of open space with 4 tvachim? And the answer is because since we are dealing with maras ayin, we want for everyone to know that you're sitting in an invalid sukkah. Well, people who will see a breach of 3 tvachim might think it's less than 3 tvachim. Only when it's a tefach more than the problem is it clear to all that this sukkah is invalid. In other words, invalidate the sukkah. Today that would mean, another way of doing it is if you have a sukkah to begin with that only has 3 walls, have a goy take down the third wall, open up a wall. The sukkah should be invalid. Rabbi Shua ben Levi Amar, I have another solution. What's my other solution? Madlik bas aneir. Again, we learned earlier on Daf Chavtes that if you have a small sukkah, don't light a candle in there. Now, it doesn't invalidate the sukkah, but you're not allowed to light a candle in a small sukkah. So if you're going to light a candle in the sukkah, you are showing that you know that it's not l'shei mitzvah sukkah. You're doing something that you may not do in a sukkah. You're only eating there because that's the best place you have, or that's the only place you have. And the Gemara even adds, v'lei pligi. They're not arguing, but the reason why Rab Chia bar Ashi or Rab Chia bar Av doesn't give the solution of Rabbi Shua ben Levi is lon. Lon means us. Us means the people in Bavel. People in Bavel, like we mentioned, we have to eat in the sukkah on the 8th day because the 8th day might be the 7th. That was the whole sukkah we learned yesterday. We paskin like Rabbi Yechanan. We taka don't make a bracha, but we have to eat in the sukkah. So you cannot invalidate the sukkah. So leave the sukkah intact, but do an activity that you normally may not do on sukkahs to address the maras ayin of Baal Tosef. And halahu, the people that live in Eretz Yisrael, they taka don't eat at all in the sukkah on the 8th day. So for them, it's even better to invalidate the sukkah. And now we're going back to what we learned, these dinim. When did we say it's forbidden to light a small candle in the sukkah? Only if you have a very small sukkah. So the Gemara says, well, tinach sukkah ketana, just lighting a candle is the way you address the appearance, right, of Baal Tosef. But sukkah gedolah, that we learned also on Daf Chavtes, there's nothing wrong lighting candles. We do that. We light the Yom Tov candles of sukkahs in the sukkah. There's no problem. It doesn't address the appearance of Baal Tosef. So the Gemara says, do something else that normally you don't do in a large sukkah. And as we learned, the meyayel b'money michla, that you bring into the sukkah, money, the michla means utensils that are used for eating, but it means soiled utensils that are used for eating, that one should not keep in the sukkah during the 7 days. The Amarava, like Rava taught us, that mali mechla, that if you have soiled eating utensils, bar mimitalalta, it should be kept outside the shaded area, which means outside the sukkah. Only manim mashtaya, only even used utensils of drinking is allowed to be kept bimitalalta. In other words, do something that one should not do on sukkahs in order for everyone to see that you know that you're not adding, God forbid, in the mitzvah of sitting another day in the sukkah, but that's the only location you have where to eat. Next Mishnah, again referring back to the Mishnah on Daf Man Beis Amid Beis. So what did the Mishnah say over there? That Nisul Chamayim, that the mitzvah, which is according to most halacha l'Moshe Sinai, in addition to pouring the wine on the altar during the offering of the Koren Tamid, we also pour water, and that is done. The Mishnah says, for a full 7 days. Ketzad, how did they get that Says the Mishnah. Shaloichis shel zahav, they would take a golden pitcher, a golden barrel. How large? That's machzekes shloisha lugin, that can hold 3 lug. According to the Tanach, we just quoted this yesterday, the quantity of water every day was 3 lug. From where did they get that water? Shiluach is a fresh water spring right outside Yerushalayim. And there are many other details of how, even when they went to get it, there was already a huge celebration, but we'll speak about that more later. But we'll just focus on these details. They would get the water from the shiluach, and when they would return, higiu l'shar hamayim. Guys, we learned shar hamayim in Shkolim, we learned shar hamayim in Yuma. It's one of the southern gates of the temple courtyard of the Azara. Then tiku, or vehariyu v'tiku. Then they would blow the trumpets, making the sounds of Tkiya. Teruah means either Shavarim or Teruah, so we do both Shavarim Teruah and only Shavarim and only Teruah. That's Toko V'Riyo V'Taku. And why did they do that, guys? Unlike the shofar, with the 10 reasons we have, but by the trumpets were were sounded to express joy, as we have Ushafta Mayim B'Sasin. There was a lot of celebration connected with every step of this Nisuch HaMayim. And now that he's going up the altar to actually pour the water, here, let's go. Allah Ba'Kevesh. The Kohen would go up the ramp. And remember, Chevra, the ramp, let's say it goes from south to north. Right, the length of the ramp was 32 amas. The width of the ramp was 16 amas. Normally we learned a side of Yom Kippur, side of the Kohen Gadol that goes normally up the middle. Remember, we learned that the Kohen normally goes up towards the right, which means towards the east. Not over here. Because since the bowl into which the water is poured is going to be sharp left, because it's going to be on the southern western corner, so when he would go up the ramp, Nifna L'Smaila, he would right away turn left. And that's one of the 3 exceptions. In all other cases, the Kohen would turn dafka right and make a full circle around the altar, not over here. Now, when he turned to the left, so if you're going from south to north, left would mean west. There were 2 silver bowls. And before we go on, the Mishnah just mentioned that the water was in a golden soloiches. It's going to be poured, according to the Tanach, into a silver bowl. Now we have a problem. What's the problem? Look inside the last Tosfos in the Amid that we learned in Menachos. And we also have it, if I'm not mistaken, we learned this either in Yom or in Shkalim. That there were, remember the 2 tables that were in the empty chamber, I'm reading inside Tosfos, one was made out of silver, one was made out of gold. When the lechem upon him that was baked on Erev Shabbos was prepared, it was left dafke on the silver table. And then when the lechem upon him breads were removed, they were placed on the golden table. They were not put down on the silver table. Why? Because of Mailan B'Kodesh V'Loi Moridin. Since the shulchan upon him was made out of gold, at least loy moridin, if they put it down, which they needed to, until they would bring the shnei bazichen, they would put it on a golden table. You don't go from gold to silver. So Tosfos' question is, how can you have water coming from a golden soloiches? How can it go into a silver bowl? Isn't that moiridin? So Tosfos answers 3 lines from the bottom that since these bowls, hoyakavoyim besid, they were affixed to the altar with lime. In other words, once they became kavua in the mizbeach, they no longer have a halachic status of kelim. They are considered like altar. And once it's altar, anything that's put on the altar, even if it's coming from gold, is not viewed as something going down. And the proof that Tosfos brings is cited from the lechem apanim. What part of the lechem apanim was offered on the mizbeach? None of the 12 breads, but yes, both spoons that had in it the frankincense, the bazichen were made out of gold. Where did they put the frankincense? On the altar. Hold on. You're going from gold to the altar. That's not only is it not moiridin, in the mizbeach it's mailin. So since the silver bowls were affixed to the mizbeach, there is no issue, even though the water is coming from a golden picture. Tosfos, beautiful. Back in the Mishnah. The Tanach Rabbi Yehuda really argues with various things that were said in the Mishnah, but beginning with, he disagrees that the bowls were made out of silver. Rabbi Yehuda says, the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda says, that shall sid hoyu, that the bowls were made out of plaster. Rabbi Meir Shapiro beautifully explains what's underlying this machlekes. He says, Gavaldik, it says at the end of Parshas Yisroi that that when it comes to the stones of the altar, it's not only that you can't bring metal on Harabayas, so when they would chisel the stones for the building of the temple, they would do it beyond Harabayas. But when it comes to the stones and any other part of the Mizbeach, even metal just touching it, I don't care where, invalidated that stone to be used. The question is, do we view silver as a metal or not? That's the question. If silver, which is in the general category of a metal, it's a precious metal, but it's a metal, then how can you have silver touching the Mizbeach? It's going to be machalal the Mizbeach. So that's why Rabbi Yehuda holds that they were unable to use silver, and therefore he holds that it was made out of plaster, and by the way, plaster made it symmetrically beautiful with the Mizbeach. If you remember when we learned about the building of the Mizbeach, there was a form that was made, and I know that it was stones, smooth stones, but what kept all of the stones together was plaster. And then it was covered, it was cement, and there was plaster, so there were two bowls made out of sid. Now, another interesting l'chu'ura detail. How is there a machlekes and mitzias? Like, come on guys, we're just 100 years or 200 years after the Churban Abayis, don't you remember? No, because even silver, as we know, silver oxidates. Silver becomes blackened. And this plaster was also darkened. In other words, whether it was made out of plaster, whether it was made out of silver, it had the same appearance. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda is addressing. It was plaster. Now plaster begins very light, white, but it became darkened because of the wine. And as the Gemara is going to ask, we're going to see that the two bowls, one was for wine, one was for water. Why did the water one also become dark? We'll get to that in the Gemara. Another detail. Both of these bowls, MERCAVA, were perforated. Daf mem ches amud beis. So whatever was poured in them, the liquid went to the bottom of the bowl, but it wasn't contained in the bowl. And kimin shnei chaytamin dakin, it was like two thin nostrils. Rashi goes more into the detail, the top Rashi, that there was a nostril or a hole at the bottom of each bowl, and therefore the liquid that was poured in it went out of the nostril, it went on the mizbeach, and water has a nature that it simply works its way downwards, and it found its way ultimately into the two shisin that were under the altar. These are two holes, nostrils, that went all the way. We'll learn this, God willing, tomorrow, the sugya of the shisin, really to the core of the world. Back in the Mishnah, even though they both had the same size, the bowls had the same size, and they both had holes, but the opening of the hole was different. Echad me'uva, one opening was thick, and one opening was thin. And why is that? In order for the liquids, wine and water on Sukah, that were poured from the coin at the same time, that they should be emptied from their bowls at the same time. Now what's the challenge? Two challenges. Number one, according to the Tanach, there was 3 loig of water. But as we'll see in a moment, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there was only 1 loig of water. L'kula alma, there was 3 loig of wine. So if you have a lot more wine than water, for the bowls to be emptied at the same time, the hole in the bottom of the bowl of the wine must be larger. Vaited. And then we'll learn also that even according to the Tanach, that the quantity was the same. That we'll learn. I'm already getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Since wine is thicker than water, water drains quicker than wine. So again, the hole in the water bowl was thinner. Again, this is just to work out that both holes should be kolin bebasachas. Now, ma'aravai shalmayim. The one that was more towards the west was the bowl used for water. Mizrachi, the one relative, which was closer to the east. No bowls were in the east. Everything was in the southern western corner, but they were side by side. And the eastern bowl was used for wine. And the reason for that is, we just said on Amud Aleph, the coin made a left. Which bowl would he encounter first? He's going from east to west, but he would encounter the eastern bowl first. Being that every day of the year wine was offered, water was only added for the 7 days of Sukkot, and based on the rule of tadir v'she'ena tadim, frequent versus that which is less frequent, tadir kaidem. So therefore, the closest bowl, you want to first pour the wine, or you want to at least get to the wine bowl first. So the one to the east, which was the closest, was the one that was designated for wine, but it was not essential. In other words, if by mistake you poured the water inside the bowl that normally should have been used for the wine, and the same thing is vice versa, you poured the wine inside the bowl that normally should have been used for the water, into the westernmost bowl, you are yotza, which is takawai. Rabbi Yehuda holds both bowls were blackened because there were times that they made such a confusion, and yes, there were plenty of times that wine was poured into the water bowl, and that darkened the sid, And according to the Tanach, they were made out of silver. And as we know, that silver with time, it tarnishes, it becomes oxidated, it becomes darkened. It had this darkish look. Now, Rabbi Yehuda tells the Tanakama a couple of things. 2 points over here. Aside of his machlokes in what was the bowl made out of, he has another 2 points of contention. You, the Tanakama, say that how large were these pitchers of gold? How much water was used every day? The Tanakama said 3 loig. So Rabbi Yehuda says no, beloig hoyem enasich. Only 1 lug, not 3. Number 2, you, Tanakama, said that Nisuch Hamayim was done for 7 days and not the 8th. I hold that it was done for all of the 8 days. Now, says the Mishnah weiter, Vilam naseich oimer loi, to the pourer of the water, the oilam, the people gathered would say, Hagbe yodecha, raise your hands while you pour the water. In other words, we would like to clearly see that the water is being poured in the bowl. Why was that needed? Because shapam achaz, there was a time that nosach echad al gaber raglov, that there was an echad, and according to many, this refers to Alexander Yanai, the Chashmonoic, wicked king. That amongst the, first of all, he assumed the position of a kohen which he should not have. He did not believe in the Torah Shebal Peh, which he should have. He did not believe in the pouring of the water. In order to appease the crowd, he walked up there with water, but he poured the water al gaber raglov. Now, initially, people wouldn't have seen it, but they somehow did see it. And the people revolted against him. Everyone pelted him with their esrogim. There are really more parts to the story that the Gemara will elaborate. So to prevent that from happening, they would tell the lam nasech, they would tell the pourer, pour it in a way where everyone can see exactly that the water is coming from the golden pitcher and it's going into the bowl which is connected on top of the mizbeach. Another din, says the Mishnah, that unlike lulav, for example, that we learned that even in the Beis HaMikdash, if not on the first day, you don't take the lulav, right? Shisha, Veshiva. But here, when it comes to the Nisach Hamayim, it's done for all of the days, whether it's 7 or whether it's 8. There's always the Nisach Hamayim. Ella, there's one difference, and that is that we may not carry Hoitzah on Shabbos as Asur. So the water that's being used would be prepared from Erev Shabbos. Elosh hoy mamalim Erev Shabbos, the golden barrel, the golden soloiches was filled up from before Shabbos. Shabbos chavish shel zav, they would take a golden barrel. And listen, she'eina mikudeshes, that's not consecrated. If you have a klei shares, everything that goes into it is imbued with what we call kedushas haguf, and it becomes invalidated overnight. Psul lina. It's only kosher the day it was in the keli, for that day and for that night. By the break of dawn, it's going to become puzzle. Being that they would gather the water on Erev Shabbos, but this water would be used on Shabbos, morning Tamid, so they needed to put it in a keli that was not Mikodeshes, and they would gather the water from the same place, from the Shiluach. Where would they keep it? Umanicha, there was a chamber, there was a lishka, in which we stored the water. Now, says the Mishnah, what happens if Nishpachov, the water spilled out of this golden barrel? Or another issue, if Nizgalsa, if that barrel was uncovered. Now what's the issue of uncovering water? So we know already that we may not drink water that was in a keli that was uncovered because there was a chashash physically and spiritually that nachashim va'akravim, that venomous creatures will go and drink from the water and deposit some of their venom. But don't forget, no one is drinking this water. So of course there's an inyan of, something that you cannot eat, you never give to God. But there's a bigger issue. I'm not minimizing that it's not nice to give to God something that might have poison in it. The bigger issue is that there is a minimum amount of water that you have to pour, 3 loig or 1 loig. You didn't pour more than that. If some of that is venom, well, that means it's not fully the shiur. So then you didn't pour enough water. So the water has to remain covered, says Rashi. But if it was uncovered, being that you may not carry, so you can't get new water from the Shiluach on Shabbos Kodesh, what would you do? What was the substitute? Then you can fill up water in the Tzaloiches from the washing basin, which was always covered. Which has no problem with Mayim Megulim. Shahayayin Vahamayim migulim, even though no one is drinking it, is possible for it to be used on the altar. Again, Rashi writes, because of then, if you will use mayim or yayin migulim, you'll be missing the shiur. Beyond that, there is a concept of, would you give your governor something? And if you would not, don't give it to God. Since we are not allowed to drink, not water nor wine that was left uncovered, therefore it also may not be given and used on the altar. Just speaking about, we learned the sugya in brachas, that nowadays, since we don't have that amount of venomous creatures, if water is left uncovered for a small amount of time, it won't become, so to say, chamira sakanta mi yisura, and you can't consume it. But if it's overnighted and uncovered, then many people today, al pi Kabbalah, are very careful not to drink it. I know people that don't even use these large water heaters because they are, say it's mayim megulim, that's already a stretch. Halachically, wine that's left uncovered overnight may not be used for kiddush, and that's connected to this halacha, that wine that's megulim is pasul legabe mizbeach. All right, says the Gemara. We're focusing on the detail that while they would bring the water, the Kaihanim would blow trumpets. Trumpets are blown to add in joy. How do you know that there's joy associated with the pouring of the water? That's the Minah Hanamili, says Rashi. The Toikinu Marian B'Shiva Samayim Shal Nisuch. So Amar Avena, the Amar Kra, Pasuk in Yeshaya, Ushaftem Mayim B'Sasim. Gavaldik. So here clearly you see that the drawing of the water, and that's referring to the water that's used on the holiday of Sukah, is Fenisoch HaMayim, it should be done with Sasin. So now we have, actually, there are 10 words of joy in the holy tongue. We're going to be focusing on 2, Sasin and Simcha. I want to give a good intro to this Agadata, that Sasin means an outer expression of joy. And Simcha is an inner feeling of joy. And this is going to be a dialogue that we all have, and every side is right, but there are 2 positions. How does it work? Is it inner outer or outer inner? And ideally, you should feel the Simcha, and it should be so overflowing that it should come out on a level of sasin. It should become externalized. On the other hand, if you're not feeling the simcha, many times you tell a person, go into an environment of sasin, fake it until you make it is not a nice expression, but the concept, do the outer steps of sasin, and then it's going to go inwards. And that's really one way of understanding the beautiful agadata that we're going to learn right now. So says the Gemara, Hanu Trei Mine, there were 2 heretics. And that what Chatshemei Sasain, one's name was Sasain, and the other one's name was Simcha. And they're having a conversation. Amalei Sasain LeSimcha, Sasain tells Simcha, Ano adifa minach, I'm greater than you. Why? Because it says, Sasain v'Simcha yasigu. Sasain is rejoicing, Simcha is gladness. Again, Sasain is an outer expression without the feeling. Simcha is just the inner feeling. Since the Seder, the order in the verses, first Sasain and then Simcha, that they shall attain, is Araya, that you go from outer inner. Amalei Simcha lo Sasain, well, you want to quote scripture, Anodif Naminach. B'chlal, heretics until today, all these missionaries, they love quoting scripture. They quote it out of context. They're quoting verses. So here you have, they're quoting Psukim. Because it says, Simcha v'Sasain la Yehudim. So you have one time like this, one time like that. And maybe that's why were they heretics in this story. And I got it because that's exactly what the heretics do. They don't know the context. They don't know the whole thing. They focus in on one half a verse and they build a whole building on it. And if you would know more, whatever they bring a verse one way, if you're knowledgeable enough, you'll bring a verse to say the opposite. The best thing is not to have any interactions with missionaries, because all of their logical proofs are nonsensical, and it's not based on that. You're not gonna, you can win the debate, but you're not gonna win them over. That's very important. Aside of the exceptions, the main thing is to ignore them. Amalei Sasin LeSimcha, another conversation. Sasin told Simcha, I want you to know that Chad Yoimach, that one day in the future, Shafkuch, you will be stripped, your power will be taken away from you. And you will be made v'shavyuch lepravanka. You'll be made into a scout. A scout is when you send a messenger ahead of the king. That's called a pravanka. In other words, what Sasin is telling Simcha, that the chsiv, it says ki b'simcha seitzeyu. In other words, you'll be sent out.
And I think l'chayda, what that means is that in the future, we're going to be more pnimiyazdika people. First, we're going to have simcha, and then we're going to have sasing. That's in the future. But in the world right now, not everyone can innerly feel the simcha. But we can all go through the motions. And maybe the Seder now is more, first go through the motions, and then later you'll get simcha. Amalei simcha lo sasa, in the opposite. That chad yom eshav koch, that in the future, you will be sent ahead. You will be sent out. And what will you be used for? Umalu bach maya. And in the future, they will use you as a container to fill it with water. That's clearly, that sasain is the container, the outer, and it's going to be filled with water, as it says, "Ushafte mayim bisasin," you will be filled. So Amalei ahumina the shmei sasin larababo. Similarly, that asidisu this esmaloli maya la'amud asi. That in the future, you, the Jewish people, are destined to draw water for me. You're going to bring water to me, as it says, "Ushafte mayim." Bisasin. Now it's not lisasin, it's bisasin. So Amalei, to which Rababo tells this heretic, havaksiv lisasin, then you would have been right, that we would have been servicing you. Hashadaksiv bisasin, but ushaftamayim in the sasin, which means that mashche dahu gavra, that the skin, the outer part of sasin, which is an outer feeling, an outer expression of joy, mishavinon le guda, it will be viewed as a canteen, as a keli that is hallowed, umalinon be maya, and you will be filled with maya. In other words, the Maimer and the whole theme in Chassidus on the Haftarah that we read on Parshas Vayera, the Isha Achas Minashei B'nei Hanavim, that she was told by Elisha that she should have vessels, and a miracle happened, and the oil filled all of those vessels. In other words, that right now we got to go through the motions. Every mitzvah makes a keli. I am not feeling the oil, I'm not feeling the joy. In the future, all of the mitzvahs that we do now will be the kelim that God will use to give us some inner light that we are unable to access as of yet. In other words, the conclusion is that in the world of Galus, we start with the outer. That's the whole Yiddishkeit, Nasev and Nishma. And when we do the right things and we create the keli, then eventually in the future it's going to be filled up. All right, weiter. Back to the Gemara. Allah ba'kevesh. Ufana l'smailai, the Kohen would turn to his left. Chulei, Tana Rabbanon, the last narrow line. Kol ha'olim lamizbeach, kol ha'olim lamizbeach. Normally, whoever would go up the altar, Kohen Gadol, oilim derech yamin. When he would come to the top of the ramp, he's going from south to north. He would turn to his right. And even if he, for example, by a carbon chatos, he got to apply the blood to all of the four horns. Well, you begin on the first horn to the right. You begin on the southern eastern horn. And then you walk around the altar. And then v'yorden dalar smoil. And then you go down on the left side. That means you go up really towards the east and you go down towards the west. But for the following three, we have the exception. What's the exception? That even though you go up the ramp, you don't turn right, you turn left. Second white line. And when you have to go down, you descend exactly by the way that you came up. Literally, it means you descend by your heel. It means you make a 180 and you go right back down. You don't make an entire circle around the altar. Now, there's a reason for that, but let's see what the three are, and then we'll right away realize the reason. These are the following three exceptions. When the Kohen would go up with the tzeloichias of mayim, nisuch hamayim, don't forget, Chavre, that the bowl was right away to his left. Yeah, it was a little bit more towards the west, but it was towards the left. So there's also a concept, why will you make him encircle the whole top of the altar for what? The only avodah is to do something that's on his immediately left, so go right away over there. And the next exception is nisuch hayayin, when wine is poured, also even closer. The bowl was right away to his left. And the third was when you slaughter a bird oila, even though number one, the melika has to be done on the higher part of the altar, above the chut hasikra. Not only that, ideally you want to be doing it on the westernmost side of the altar. Why? If you remember, because the skin and the feathers and the first stomach that is removed from the bird prior to burning it on the altar needed to be thrown from the Kohen's hand to the Mekayim Hadeshen. The Mekayim Hadeshen, the place where the ash was put. You remember? It's 3 tfachim towards the east of the ramp, and if you're going from south to north, if you're going from north to south, it's 10 tfachim away from the northern end of the ramp. There was a specific location where the ashes were placed every day, and the Kohen who's up there has to throw feathers, which is light, together with the crop on the Mekayim Hadeshen. So you want for the Kohen to be the closest possible to the place where he has to hit. He must have had good aim. But if there were many people bringing a bird oil at the same time, and there was no physical space for the Kohen to stand there, so then the other option would have been that he would go to the west. In that case, he would go up the ramp and he would turn a left, because if the whole avodah is something that's done dafka to the west, there's no reason for him to encircle the mizbeach. Now, my friends, Bekitzer, just applying it today in a shul, and in many times, the bima is like the mizbeach. Yes, there is a rule that kol pina sha'ata poina lo tehi ela derech yamin. If when you're called to the Torah right now, if going to your right or going to your left would get you to your place of the Aliyah at the same time, if it's equal distance, go to the right, go around the bima the way the Sefer Torah is taken to the bima when it's brought to the bima. But if you are much closer, going derech smoil, l'kvoid ha-Torah, l'kvoid ha-tzibur, we take a go derech smoil. In other words, if you're called for something specific, we don't want to waste time. Let's go right. 3 lines. Elom. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the bowls were made out of plaster. Shahoyu mashchirim, they were blackened. So that's why maybe Rabbi Yehuda is, I think, trying to say, that's why people might have thought that it was made out of silver, because it looked like tarnished silver. Now, the bowl that was used for wine, mashchir, it became blackened because, it was filled with wine. But the maya, amay mashchir, answers the Gemara. Even though Amar Mar, the master, the Tanach taught us on top, we learned in the Mishnah, that even though the bowls were designated, but it was not essential, it was not exclusive mamish, you could have mixed one with the other, that ira shal mayim l'teich yayin, or shal yayin l'teich mayim, then after the fact you're yatsa. So shal mayim also asi lashchuri, because there were times that you poured the wine in the water bowl. Okay. Then the Mishnah said weiter, uminu kavim, that there were holes, there was a perforation in the bottom of these bowls, like 2 nostrils, etc. And the Mishnah says that they had different sizes. The havamina of the Gemara is that why were they different sizes? Because the quantity of water was very dissimilar to the quantity of wine. And being that we wanted for both of the bowls to be emptied at the same time, you needed to make 2 different sizes. Now, was the quantity different? Well, according to the Tanakama, no. The Tanakama says water was 3 loig. Everyone holds that the amount of wine is a quarter of a hin. Remember that? A hin is 12 loig. A quarter of a hin is 3 loig. So maybe our Mishnah only follows Rabbi Yehuda. Because the Tanan we learned in our Mishnah, only Rabbi Yehuda holds that the water had a much smaller amount, which means the hole must have been made much bigger for the water to drain quicker. Because they either abanon, then ki hadadinino, it's the same amount. Then the holes would have been made the same size. Answers the Gemara, nish. That statement is according to all. Maybe this even goes according to the Chachamim. Chamra, wine, smich is thick. Doesn't drain as quick as water. Mayim is kolish. Mayim is much thinner. You want them to be emptied at the same time. You must make the water hole smaller. And Hachinam mistabra, because if the author of this statement would have come from Rabbi Yehuda, who also holds that the holes were different, but the words that our Mishnah uses, mu'uva and dak, thick and thin. There is a word, are words that indicate a greater difference, and those words are wide and narrow. Wide and narrow indicates the distance between wide and narrow is greater than the distance in space, than the difference between thick and thin. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, dafka, because he holds that the water was only 1 loig, then the size of the holes were much greater one from the other, which is why Rabbi Yehuda uses the words Rachav and Katzer. Rachav and Katzer Islay. The Tanya. Rabbi Yehuda Oimer. Interestingly, he doesn't. In our Mishnah, the word of these bowls were Sephalim. In this Braisa, the words of these bowls are Kas Vo'is. Kalim. Holy Kalim. Kas Vo'is, Hoyisham, Echad Shalmayim, Echad Shal Yayin. Shel yayin piyarachav. See, here's Rabbi Yehuda. The mouth was wide. Shel mayim piyam katzer. The water had a smaller size. Don't forget, guys, according to Rabbi Yehuda, don't forget the water only has one leg. So not only did it drain quicker than wine, but there was much less to drain. You really needed to make the hole much smaller, which is taka why Rabbi Yehuda uses the contrast rachav katzer versus mu'uva and dak. Indeed, shmamina. Not only is it also according to the Chachamim, but the statement on the top of the line in our Amid, echad mu'uva ve'echad dak. These words were said by the Chachamim. Everyone agrees the holes are different sizes, but this statement is only la Chachamim. 3 lines from the bottom. And the Mishnah said that ma'aravoi shalmayim, that means when the coin went up, the one that's more distant was for water, the one that was closer was wine. Even though they poured it at the same time, we wanted for the coin to reach the bowl that is tadir, because of the rule, tadir v'she'ena tadir. Okay, now says the Gemara, Tanach Rabbanan, we will elaborate more on the story about that echad, that instead of pouring the water in the bowl, he poured it on his feet. And you should know that that act, even though that the crowd fought against him, was a terrible thing, because of that moment, the tzaddukim became empowered. And all of that led to Christianity, which is exactly what happened by those who reject the oral Torah, and all of the tzadis and the millions of Jews that were killed because of the tzaddukim. Tanach Rabbanan, Maisi b'tzedukah echad. Our Mishnah doesn't even call him a tzadduki. And all of this, again, this is according to many, that's Alexander the Yanai, the king, the Chashmonai king, the evil, wicked king. Shenisach al gaba raglav, that he poured the water on his feet. He didn't accept that the oral Torah. Halacha l'moshe misinai. Doesn't say in the Torah. Even with the remez of Mayim, he didn't accept that. Urogomu kol ha'am be'esrei geim. And everyone used their esrei to pelt him. Now I would just put this together with what we learned in the prior chapter. Remember on Shemitah, I think that the most expensive item was the lulavim. The esregim were very cheap. Maybe today they would pelt him with the lulavim. They would get him with the lulavim because whatever they threw at him, that was goodbye to that. Now another detail. That day, one of the horns got blemished. One of the horns were damaged. An esreg cannot damage a horn. So Rashi writes over here that what really happened was that the end of the Gemara is that when people were throwing the esrogim, see, once you accept a certain amount of physical violence, you can't limit it. So listen, a guy getting pelted with esrogim is not comfortable, but it's not dangerous. Some people felt l'shem shamayim or not so l'shem shamayim. We're going to get this guy with stones, and no one will know that I threw the stone because there are so many esrogim flying. No one will notice it. A stone hit a horn and it knocked the horn, it damaged, it invalidated the whole mizbeach. And what did they do? They took a fistful of salt and samuhu, they concealed the damage. Concealing the damage doesn't mean that made the mizbeach okay. It was not okay. It invalidated the whole mizbeach. And there's a message to that this person horrible, shame on him, that he did something wrong. But the reaction towards that, if you're going to go into Azag Gevura, what did you accomplish? Nothing. What you accomplished was, you see, they're violent. And furthermore, they went ahead and they invalidated the altar. And the reason why they filled it up or they concealed it with salt, says the Braisa, don't think that, now everything is fine and dandy. No, it's not. We at least don't want for the altar to appear damaged. Second time today, Marasayan. Even though the Mizbeach needed to be fixed, it needed to be actually, you have to, make another form and you have to fill it up as we learned how we built the Mizbeach. At least it doesn't look so bad. Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph. And how do we know that if even only the horn is damaged, the whole altar is not valid? Because the horn is an essential part of the altar. Shekol Mizbeach, this is Zvachim, that doesn't have a ramp. You can also argue, who needs the ramp? No. If a Mizbeach doesn't have a ramp, or Veloy Keren, if it doesn't even have one of the 4 horns, and they have to be wholesome, nor if it doesn't have a base, Or if it's not perfectly ribua, it's pasul la'avoida. And Rabbi Yosi bar Yehuda Omer, even if it doesn't have a ledge, it's also going to be pasul la'avoida. Okay, Cheva, we'll stop over here. And tomorrow, exciting, we're going to start learning details about the shisin, again about these two holes, into which the wine and the water would pour, and those holes actually went into the core of the world, to be continued.